So just by understanding reward prediction error, and especially by understanding that a craving triggers a peak in dopamine that makes you motivated, but then drops your level of dopamine below baseline, which makes you even more motivated, you are already halfway through the conceptual aspect of today's podcast. Because if you can understand that, you will understand why, for instance, when you initially want something or you think you want something, it puts you into motion, but then pretty quickly you're starting to feel the pain of not having that, and that is also contributing to your desire to pursue that thing. Your craving for things is not just about craving for those things per se, it's also a desire to relieve the pain of not having those things. And if you can internalize that and start to develop an awareness around it, you will be in an amazing position to leverage all sorts of aspects of the dopamine system in order to increase your motivation, especially when things get really hard or when you have the propensity to procrastinate, which is something that we'll get into a little bit later in the podcast. I know to some people this might seem foreign, but I love to exercise. I love to do resistance training. I love to run. I am not one of those people that doesn't like the experience of exercising, but likes the feeling afterwards, quote unquote. I hear that a lot. I don't like to exercise, but I love the way I feel afterwards. L-tyrosine, however, has been examined in the scientific literature and at reasonably low dosages has been shown to increase circulating and available levels of dopamine, both in the brain and body, and lead to increased cognitive performance and in some cases, physical output. I'll provide links to a few of these studies, but the two that I really parsed most finely for sake of this episode really just focus on taking L-tyrosine under conditions where your baseline levels of dopamine are reduced due to stress and under conditions where there's no stress and people are trying to increase their baseline levels of dopamine for sake of improving cognitive function. Anna Lemke's book, Dopamine Nation, and on this podcast, excellent book, by the way, I highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. It's a fascinating exploration into dopamine as it relates to addiction, not just drug addiction, but other types of addiction. Again, the name of that book is Dopamine Nation. We'll provide a link to it in the show note captions. The other thing that happens after those big, fast increases in dopamine caused by things like cocaine is afterwards, when it quickly drops below baseline, it takes a much longer time to get back to the original baseline than it did prior to using the drug. And worse still is that the peaks in dopamine that are created from more consumption of cocaine leads to progressively lower peaks and deeper troughs below baseline. So the whole system is shifting away from pleasure and more to pain and the desire for pursuit of the drug. Now, this is a terrible situation, and it's a terrible situation that's not just unique to cocaine. So the pathway from VTA and nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cortex is absolutely critical for today's discussion because we are largely going to be discussing motivation, drive, pursuit, procrastination, and all sorts of things that have to do with our feelings about context, whether or not we want to do something or not, whether or not we feel we should or we shouldn't, whether or not we feel we failed the last time or there's a high probability of success the next time. Prefrontal cortex does many, many things. So it's involved in everything from planning and executing of action to making good or bad decisions depending on context. In fact, one of the primary functions of prefrontal cortex is to really understand context, whether or not, for instance, you are alone in your room where certain behaviors are appropriate, whether or not you are at work where other behaviors are appropriate. Understanding what the context is and therefore what sorts of actions need to be generated and suppressed. In fact, a guest on the Huberman Lab podcast, and this is a guest whose episode hasn't aired yet, described this beautifully. He's a neurosurgeon, and he said, the way to think about the prefrontal cortex is it's basically an area of the brain that says shh or no, not now, to other brain regions in order to suppress action. And we know this because people that have damage to the prefrontal cortex often can't suppress their impulses. Okay, so the pathway from VTA and nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cortex is absolutely critical for today's discussion because we are largely going to be discussing motivation, drive, pursuit, procrastination, and all sorts of things that have to do with our feelings about context, whether or not we want to do something or not, whether or not we feel we should or we shouldn't, whether or not we feel we failed the last time or there's a high probability of success the next time. Prefrontal cortex does many, many things, but When thinking about dopamine's role in the prefrontal cortex, that is, when thinking about this mesocortical pathway, we really want to think about how dopamine is activating or changing our propensity to do certain things and get us into action, or prevent us from doing certain things and prevent action. So basically, you can think about the mesocortical pathway as a circuit that really governs all of the major choices that you're going to make in life about what to do and what not to do toward your goals and away from the things that you want to avoid. Now, the fourth dopamine pathway in the brain is the so-called tuberoinfundibular pathway. And this is not one we're going to focus on too much today. This is a pathway that relates to connections between the brain and your pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland being that gland that's, as I mentioned a moment ago, is also receiving input from the hypothalamus and is releasing a bunch of hormones into your bloodstream, things like luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, things like melanocortin hormone.